Hi, I'm Chris Silva, and thanks for taking my class, Intro to Fine Silver Fusing. This is a great class for beginners. If you've never worked with fine silver, you're going to make some great components today, as well as this great chain. I'd like to talk to you about safety. Since we're working with a torch, I'd like to make sure that your station is going to be safe and secure. I like to have a fire extinguisher nearby. I like to work with safety glasses. And I also recommend that you have a protective covering over your table, like a cookie sheet or a metal sheet. And when you're working with a torch or any kind of flame, you want to make sure that you're in a well-ventilated area. Now, before you start fusing, I recommend watching our torch safety class. This class offers you all the information you need to know to get started working with a torch. That way, you'll be able to work with a torch safely and with ease. Let's get started. Well, here's my setup. I like to protect my surface with a cookie sheet, and I also use a pumice kiln brick and a tripod with mesh screen. I like to use this when I need to have some height and I don't want to bend over. And the nice thing about this is that the legs screw on and off for easy storage. Here are some things that we need for today's class: safety glasses, cool cup with tweezers, butane torch, and the butane fuel. I'd like to take this time to show you how to fill your torch. I'm going to remove the bottom and expose the valve, which is how we're going to fill the torch. Now, as we're doing this, you want to make sure that this is done in a well-ventilated area. I'm going ahead and bring my torch upside down. In a straight up and down position, I'm going to depress the fuel into the valve and count to about 10 seconds as you're filling the torch. Or until it spills over to make sure it's completely filled. And you want to wait anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds for the gas to completely dissipate, and then you're ready to turn it on. Here's some more tools we'll be using in today's class. We definitely need a good pair of flush cutters. Nice thing about this cutter is that it cuts our wire flush. We'll be using the 14 gauge fine silver. And keep in mind that when you're using something that thick, you don't want to use the tip of the cutter, rather the body or the center of the cutter. We'll also be using chain nose and flat nose pliers to shape the rings before we fuse them. And finally, I like to use either a gripping tweezer or an old pair of chain nose plier to handle the hot metal. So here's some more tools I use in this class today. Plastic or rawhide mallet. I use this to work hard in the rings. Since the fine silver is so soft, I need to work hard in it sometimes in order to manipulate it to form the ring that I need to get before I fuse it. And so for that, I use the nylon puck with the rawhide or plastic mallet, because I don't necessarily want to texture the metal, I just want to work hard in it. Now, I use a chasing hammer to texture the metal after it's been fused, and in order to do that, I use my metal bench block. And to form my rings before I fuse them, I use the large wrap and tap. It allows me to form a variety of rings, even with the thickest of metals. And the nice thing about this tool is that it has a nylon sleeve, so it doesn't mar the metal. It allows me to grip the metal, form the rings without marring it. After my rings have been fused, I use a German long round nose plier to stretch out or oval out the rings. And then to polish, I use the Pro Polish pads. The wire we're going to use today is fine silver wire. We have a variety of gauges here. We have 18 being the thinnest, 16 gauge, and 14 gauge. 14 gauge is what I'm using in today's class. Reason I like to use 14 gauge as a beginner, it's a lot easier to manipulate the fusing or to control the fusing process. 16 gauge and 18 gauge give you a more delicate look, but it's a little harder to manipulate that fusing process, so that would be more of a challenge. So once you hone your skill, you can definitely move down in gauges. Well, let's get started. What I'm going to do is starting out with 14 gauge wire. I'm going to make a few rings, showing you how to make a few coils using the Wrap and Tap tool. I'll probably limit my tool use to just the large Wrap and Tap and the smallest one. This makes about a 13 millimeter sized ring. I also have my razor flush cutters ready to be used with my cast on this. And then I also have, once the rings are made, I'll be busting out my my plastic hammer and also my puck. Before you get started, if your wire looks dirty, if there's a sheen on there that's kind of whitish, that's how fine silver oxidizes. It either has like a whitish tint or a yellowish tint. It usually doesn't oxidize gray. I just take a pro polish pad. Sometimes if you have your wire sitting around, it gets a little film. It's easier to clean once the wire is straight as opposed to once the rings are made. So I just give it a couple of wipes, and you can see it's just a little bit dirty. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut the ends so that both ends are cut flush. And it's easy to recycle fine silver. And I actually have a little container where I put all my fine silver so that my fine silver is completely separate from my sterling silver, so that it's easy to recycle and refine. So the first thing I'm going to do is start out by making a coil of rings. I'm going to go ahead and insert my 14 gauge fine silver wire into my tool. Again, I'm going to be using the tip of this tool. This again will make about a 13 millimeter sized ring. I'm going to hold the wire in the tool so that there's no wire sticking out, almost like you're making a basic loop. So see how this wire is sticking out? I want to actually place that wire back further into the tool so that the tool is grabbing more of the wire, and there's no wire sticking out on this end. Now I'm going to pull. As I'm pulling on the length of this wire here, I'm going to shape with my other hand. So pulling and then shaping with my tool so that it turns all the way around. You can see that the portion of the loop has been formed. Now to continue with the coil, I want my coils to start going away from me. I want my coils to start going away from me rather than towards me. So when I bring my next row of coils, I want to bring them on the inside, which is towards me. So as I build my coil, the coils are going to be, forming away from me. So if I were to want to make more coils, then it won't be limited to what's here. The coils would just be pushing out further out that way, and then I can continue making more coils. Okay? So once I have all my coils formed, and any pieces that you might have that are sticking up like this, I just roll them directly onto either a plastic or metal anvil, and what it does is it just pushes the wire down for you so that you can use the whole coil solid. Once the coil is formed, the next step is cutting each ring perfectly flush so that once the rings are smooth, then they're ready to be fused. So we've positioned the camera so you can see the detail here. I just want to point to the fact that right here we've got a very smooth, a razor flush cut. There's no pinch or point in the middle of where that cut is. So keeping in line with that, now I'm ready to cut my next ring, or actually I should say I'm ready to cut one ring, or my first ring. So notice that my cutters, this back is what's going to cut it razor flush. The front part is what's going to cut it to a point. So if I want, this is razor flush, I want the other side to match with that. So I want that to be razor flush. So I'm going to cut it with the back part of my cutters, which means that with the cutters in this position, I'm going to trim the wire, and whatever's left, both ends will end up meeting to be flush. So I also need to make sure that when I'm ready to cut, my tool isn't at any angle, because then that will also give me a point. So I want to make sure that my tool is not only in the right position to cut it flush, but that the tool is also in the position to cut straight across so that it's perpendicular to the coil of the rings. So now that I am in position, I'm going to go ahead and trim that, and I'm going to show you that both sides are now cut flush, but now I have a point. So now the next step is to cut that point, again, flush. So whatever's going to be left on this side will be smooth without a tip, using the back part of my cutters. So I'm going to trim that point off right there. and it's also been cut straight across, so it's not at an angle. Maybe it has a slight angle. Now I'm going to turn my cutter again so that the other side will meet up with it and cut flush. So each time you're always going to get a point that you need to trim off before you can start cutting the next link. So each time you see me rotating my tool, my cutters, so that I always get a flush cut. Keep in mind to keep your scraps separate from your sterling silver wire. Once all my rings have been trimmed or razor flush cut, the next thing I want to show you is this. So what's going to happen is we're going to manipulate this ring to bring the gap closer together. So we're just going to bring them, and the wire is really soft. It will allow you to do this with your fingers, but if you want to use a tool, just be careful because the tools will mar your metal. Again, fine silver is really soft, so any tools that you use that are metal and you're heavy-handed, it will mark your silver. So I tend to use my fingers. Again, it is pretty soft, so it should be easy to do. So again, the manipulation of the ring so that you get a closed link right here sometimes causes the ring to be wavy so that it's not flush like this one. So if I move it, there's a little bit of movement there. So I tend to tap it using a plastic mallet, and I make sure that it's as smooth as possible. Remember, this is not for texturing. This tool is only for smoothing out the metal so that it lays flat up against your block. If it's not flush up against your block here, then it prevents a really good fuse or a really good bond once you go to the next step. So once all your rings have been cut and formed so that each ring have been cut and formed so that each ring is touching each other, so they're completely tight with no seam in between them. It's almost seamless. Then I tap them into place. I am ready for the next step. I tend to make more than the amount of rings that I want to make. So if I were to make a chain link, and let's say I needed 10 links to make that chain link, I don't just make 10 rings or jump rings. I actually make maybe 2 or 3 extra because especially the learning curve, all of them won't always fuse properly, so you might lose some rings in the process of learning. So just make a couple extra links. You saw how easy it was to make them, but once you're on a roll, you want to make sure that you keep that rhythm going so that you really get the fusing technique down. So just make a couple extra now, and then we're ready to start the fusing. Another little tip that I like to add is that sometimes in the process of shaping, see how this ring kind of comes up to a point where the connection is right there? The other little step I like to do is where the connection is, where both wires meet together, I just use my flat nose tool and bring both sides and kind of apply just a little bit of pressure. I just apply a little bit of pressure with my tool, not a lot. I don't want to clamp down on it too hard. But a little bit of pressure, what it does is the rings kind of come up to a point like this, and the pressure just brings it down just a little bit. So if you do that to all your rings, you'll have the best possible success when it comes to the next step, which is the fusing process. I'm going to mention a few things before we get started. The way I position my workstation is I have plenty of room on the outside of my block, so if something were to fall over, it's all protected, front and back, sides. I have my quenching cup behind me because when I fuse, I pick it up and I put it in my quenching cup. That way I don't have to reach over anything hot. So I don't reach in front of me, I reach from this point back to me. I don't generally use a paper towel. I use an actual towel, a small towel, because of the weight. Paper towels are too soft or light, and they tend to fly away, and you don't want any risk of air blowing in and then pushing it anywhere near a fire hazard here. So paper towels just stay put, or you can put it on your lap. The other thing I wanted to mention is we took the tripod and mesh stand off because it was too high for the camera. So what we're going to do is just use the kiln brick directly on our base here, and work so that we're working downwards instead of at eye level. I like to use my tripod so that I'm working eye level. I'm not having to look up or down, but just straight out in front of me. And it's a great tool to have, but just for the purposes of filming, we're not placing it into this into the project right now. Before we get started with the fusing, I want you to make sure that when all your rings are placed on your brick, you're going to start fusing from the top going down. Because of that, I have all my openings to my rings facing in the same direction. So if I had 10 rings, I'd have all my 10 rings facing in a row, and all the openings to the rings are facing in the same position. So the openings aren't here and here and here, they're all facing the top, or they can all be facing the bottom. That's important to know because the fusing is going to happen at that opening. So we want it to fuse correctly. We don't want to be looking for where that opening is. We'll just always know they're facing in one direction. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, I'm going to turn the torch on. I'm going to show you how to turn it on. It's going to go from the off position to the on position, and then I'm going to click it using this button. Once the flame is on, we're going to turn the lights off so you can see the position of the flame and where it needs to be. Okay, so I've already talked about where the flame needs to be, and I'm going to have you zoom in so you can see what the flame is doing and where it's going to go. What I want to do is bring the flame where the dark blue flame is touching the ring. You can see the ring getting a bright orange color. Once it turns into a bright orange color, I want to keep the flame only where the opening is. In other words, that's where I want it to melt or fuse, and that's where it's going to fuse, is at the hottest point. So if the hottest point is the opening, then that's where both ends will meet and bond together. Now I'm doing the other ring, and the camera has come in just a little closer so you can see what's going on. Actually, that was the wrong ring. So now I'm doing another ring so that you can really see what happens. Again, I'm turning my torch around the whole ring until the whole ring is a bright orange. Once it turns a bright orange, I point the flame directly to where the opening is. I don't know if you saw how fast that happened. So now we're ready to quench our pieces, and you'll hear a little sizzle sound when that happens. If you hear that sizzle sound, it's ready. You can either pick them up using your finger because they're completely cold, or you can just use your tool to go in there and pull it out. It's up to you. I place them on my rag, and I make sure that I look at both sides to make sure that both sides were completely fused. There's no opening or crease. And if I do see an opening or a crease, usually what I do is I'll do a little trick. Once I fuse, I just take my tool and turn it over like that when it's still hot, so I can just fuse the other side. Sometimes that will happen. You'll notice that you'll fuse and it looks joined, but if you turn it over, it's not joined on the other side, or there's a small crease. So you could just do it without quenching. Just flip them over like that, and then go ahead and apply heat to it evenly so it's a bright orange color, and then just bring the flame only to that crease until it fuses together, and then you're ready to quench them. Now I'm going to show you how to connect them together to form a chain. I've just fused 2 rings. Now I have a ring that's not fused. I'm going to open it up just like you would a jump ring, side to side, and slide in my 2 fused rings, and then close that up. And then once that's closed, just remember, apply any pressure needed so that that connection is really nice and smooth and tight. Now the way you connect 2 rings, or the way you connect it to make a chain link, it's going to be a little different, only because the only way to fuse is if your ring is flat. So now you have chain in there, so you can imagine what you're going to have to do to troubleshoot that. So what we've done is created a little channel that's already in the kiln brick, and you can see the channel right here. I'm going to go ahead and insert the chain links so that they're standing straight up and down. and the opening of the ring that I want to fuse is farthest away from the chain links, because that's where most of the heat is going to be concentrated, is right here. So again, the fused rings are standing straight up and down so that this ring can lay flat, and the opening where we want it to fuse or bond is farthest away. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn the lights off and have a really close-up view so you can see the fusing process happen. And it happens fairly quickly, so you really want to pay attention. And I'm also going to show you what happens in another step if you keep the heat on there too long, what happens to the ring. So right now let's just finish making an actual chain link, so it's a whole connected fused chain link to make a bracelet or a necklace. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and apply, instead of applying heat, let me just move this up. Instead of applying heat all the way around in a circle, I'm going to go in half circles from side to side, so it goes back and forth. I'm going to do that until the ring is a bright orange. Once it's a bright orange, I will go ahead and place the tip of the torch where I want it to fuse or bond. So now it's a bright orange. This is where I want the heat to be concentrated, right there where the opening is. I'm going to do it side to side until it heats up evenly, and then see how it gets milky. That's where it fuses. Now if it gets a little bubbly, I actually go ahead and apply just a little bit more heat so that it makes it a smoother texture. And notice I'm kind of moving the torch further and further to edge, and that's to move that the hottest part away from where it's already bubbled. And so there we go. It's a smoother consistency. Before I can touch the chain and do the other link that needs to be fused, I want to pick it up and quench the whole thing, because heat does travel. So even though you're not touching the rest of the chain, you are still heating up the whole thing. So I've just turned the light on so you can see, but again, remember that this whole area is very hot from the last fusing. And what I want to do is find the other chain link that it needs to be fused. I want to make sure that I find the opening first, because what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay that down without touching the top of the brick. And any other manipulation that needs to happen, like moving this chain so that it does lay straight up and down, is done with a tool, not with my finger. So now it's ready. I'm going to go ahead and concentrate the heat again, doing half circle all the way around, or not all the way around, but half circle from here to there. And once it turns a bright orange, I keep the heat concentrated on either side of that opening or that tip until it fuses together. Let's try that one more time. I'm going to go ahead and heat up my ring evenly until it's a bright orange. This time when it turns into, once it gets to a bright orange and I see it's ready to fuse, I'm going to have you maybe stop and pause and look at it over and over again so you can really see the moment of that, when that happens. So I can tell that my ring is really hot, it's a bright orange. Now I want to stop and just move it to the opening, going back and forth, back and forth. It's going to start to get like milky, or like a silvery, and which is the state before it gets liquid. And then once that happens, the fusing happens very, very quickly. So this was taking a little longer to heat up, and that's okay. Again, going back and forth. Sometimes it takes a little longer. I heat up the whole ring so it doesn't cool down before it gets to the melting point. And for some reason it doesn't. Oh, there it goes. So one side is already liquid, so I want to move the heat, concentrate the heat to the other side. If I heat one side up too long, it won't fuse. It'll pull apart. So this is a good test. That way you can see what happens. Sometimes it doesn't always cooperate. It might be dirty, which sometimes happens. The kiln brick, the dust from the kiln brick, wants to attach to the silver. Remember, because this is a pure metal, that's what allows the bonding to happen. But when the metal gets dirty, it's no longer pure, so it coats it, and it prevents it from wanting to heat up evenly to fuse. So I'm going to go ahead and stop and quench it, and then clean it up with a Pro Polish pad, and then start it all over again. It has like a white film around the edges here. If I turn it around, you can see it's much shinier on the other side. You You can see how it has shine, but on this side it almost looks like a matte silver. So that tells me that it's a little dirty. So all I'm going to do is I'm not applying too much pressure because believe it or not, this ring is really, really soft from it being exposed to heat for that long. So all I'm going to do is just rub that Pro Polish pad around the whole perimeter of this wire to kind of clean it up. And then once I do that, I'm going to go ahead and try to fuse it one more time. Notice I'm doing both sides, not just one side. And if I can go on the inside without ruining the shape of the ring, then I will. So once I notice that most of the film is gone, I'm going to go ahead and attempt to do that one more time. Again, heating the ring up evenly. So again, once we get that ring up to an even temperature and it's going to glow to a bright orange, I want to keep the heat concentrated just on the opening here, and there it goes, it's starting to fuse, and it just fused. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my torch and quench my chain. Okay, so you can see how our chain is it has been started here. I want to show you that sometimes you will get, one of the things I mentioned, I should backtrack a little bit, is that we are working with fine silver. So heat does not turn it black, which is called fire scale. The reason it happens with sterling silver is because it has copper in there and it creates a chemical reaction with heat, and so therefore it turns it black. Since there is no copper in fine silver, you don't get the fire scale, but you will notice sometimes little black marks that look just like this. And sometimes it happens because of, like one of the things I mentioned before, is that since this is pure, if any dirt touches the metal, like dust from the kiln brick, or it touches even the, or if it touches even the stainless steel sheet or aluminum sheet, that can sometimes create a chemical reaction too that causes those. But if you just apply heat to the whole chain, it burns right off because it's just a surface. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you how to texture your chain, how to change it into different shapes like squares or oval shapes. And so let's get started on the next part. We've just finished fusing our chain, so we have a section of chain. What I want to go over now is how to shape or stretch out your chain links to shape, and also texturing. The important thing to know is that at this point, once your pieces have been fused and then quenched, your chain links are really soft. Unless you want to keep your chain links completely round without texture and without shaping, then you would definitely need to tumble them in a tumbler with stainless steel shot to work hard in the pieces so that they don't lose their shape. But I really like the look of shaping and texturing. Right now is the ideal time to do it because the links are so soft. So right now I'm going to show you how to stretch out your links, and then I'll show you how to texture. So always shape first, and then the texturing is done afterwards. So I already have one link that's already been stretched. What I'm going to do is show you how to, I'll do every other one that's stretched. I'm just going to take my round nose plier, or actually this is a rosary plier, or if you have a long nose round nose plier, then that's good too. I'm going to go ahead and, it doesn't really matter where the opening is. I usually like to fuse without showing a crease. So I'm going to go ahead and do it on the side. Now if I position my tool at the very base where it's the widest, it's going to give me a really rounded edge here. But if I want to use the tip of my tool, then it'll give me a narrower edge. Maybe something like how these small ones kind of come up to a point. So right now, I'm just going to go ahead and take my tool, and I'm just going to apply just a little bit of pressure, and it stretches out just like that. And I'll do one more. And this time I'll use the tip of my tool, so I have a little narrower shape as opposed to a wider shape like that. Using a chasing hammer, this is a ball peen hammer, this is the ball peen side. What this does is it changes the shape of your metal. It flattens it. Now notice this has a slight curvature. It's a slightly convex face. It's not flush. The nice thing about this type of tool is that the edges of the hammer don't hit your metal, so it doesn't create edge, or when you strike your metal, it doesn't have any edges that hit your metal first. So it's going to be hit first by the rounded edge of your hammer, which is going to flatten out the hammer, or flatten out your wire, not create dents or marks in it. What I'm going to do is put the chain on the edge of my bench block, the stainless steel bench block, and I'm just going to tap. If I just tap straight up and down, that's just going to flatten my wire. If I tap straight up and down and out like this, it's going to stretch out my wire. So you can see how that one's stretched out compared to this one just straight up and down. So I'll just lay that down, have a close-up so you can see the difference. So this is the one that's been stretched out. It's flatter and it kind of comes out at an angle. And this one's just flattened and it's just hitting straight up and down. So you would just do that in sections. I'm going to show you how to use the ball peen part to create a different type of texture. It's going to create more of a divot into the wire. And that's what peening is called. It creates little texture in your work. So it gives you what I like to call reverse texture. It gives you two different types of texture on the same link. Now if you turn your chain over, you don't really see any of that divot work. If I were to try to do that on the opposite side, then it would remove whatever work I had on this side. So what I like to do is, so that I have texture on both sides, is I'm going to turn my chain over on the opposite side. So I have peening action here and it's smooth on this side. Turn it over, I have peening action here and then smooth on this side, so you have the reverse texture. Okay, so I want to move on to show you how to do different shapes other than ovals. Some of the great shapes that you can do with these fused rings are hearts, triangles, and squares. Those are some of the ones I'm going to show you how to do. The heart is much easier to do with maybe like an 18 or 16 gauge ring or wire fused ring, only because it does require, you want to put as minimal pressure on the actual ring itself, because you don't want the tool to create dents in the ring. You just want to be able to use the tool to shape it into what you want it. So what I'm going to do is actually use my round nose plier, and notice that I'm not going to actually hold it straight up and down like this. I'm holding it at an angle like this, and what I want to do is just shape one part of the heart here. It kind of looks like a little bean right now, but I want to shape one part of the heart. Now I'm going to do the other side. Again, not holding it straight up and down, but more at an angle, and then bringing the other side down so you can see it's starting to get the shape of a heart. And if you notice it's starting to resist the shape, I'm going to show you some little tricks. Right now I'm going back and forth to get a better shape. So you can see the heart is going to start forming. What I'm going to do now is switch from my rosary plier or round nose plier to either a chain nose or flat nose to create the point. So now switching to my chain nose or chain nose or flat nose plier, I'm going to hold it centered where the point of the heart is coming down to create the point at the bottom. So using my finger, I'm just going to push up against the other side of the opposite side of the tool, and then do the same thing to this side. Hold it with my flat nose and push up against that side so it creates an even point. Once I have this done, if I don't want it textured, I'll just take my plastic mallet and just tap it down. If I wanted to create some texture, actually let me straighten this out a little bit more. I want it to be a little bit more rounded. And if I wanted to create texture, then I would go ahead and using my chain nose plier, or I'm sorry, my my chasing hammer, just give it a couple taps. I usually like to hammer it where it's going to get the most pull. Since I want my heart to stay rounded on the edges, that's usually where I hammer so that those edges stay, and then at the point here. I might actually bring it down this point just a little bit right here. Because I've already work hardened a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and save this for the annealing, and I'll show you how to do that with a couple of other pieces. So there's my heart. Now I'm going to show you how to make a triangle. Triangle, I use, the tool that I use for that is either a chain nose or a flat nose. You can use either tool for this. What I'm going to do is create first the bottom part of the triangle. So I've created just little creases right here. Now I'm going to rotate it and create the next crease. So I have a point starting to form. So I have another point. So now I'm going to refine these points so you can see the triangle wanting to take form. Now if you were anal and you wanted to make each side exactly the same, exactly the same size, then what you would want to do is you can take a piece of string to measure the circumference of the ring. So taking a piece of string to measure the circumference, then measure that string and then divide it by 3, then you'd be able to mark where those sections were, so you'd know that at those 3 points would create an even section at all 3 points. But I'm not going to be anal, I'm just going to go ahead and do it by sight. And so little by little I'm getting the shape that I want. So I'm just rotating it until I'm rotating at all sides until I get the shape that I want. So there's my triangle. Now I'm going to show you how to do that, change that into a square. Or not change that to a square, but to make take another ring, we're going to make a square out of that. Again, same concept applies. If you want 4 sides to be completely equal, taking a string to measure, just go around the whole perimeter of your, or the whole circumference of your ring, measure that, divide that in 4, and then mark with a Sharpie all those 4 sides. But again, I just start out the same way I started out with my triangle. I'm going to start out by making one side. Start out by making one side here. There's my second side right here. And then just keep going until I have what looks to be pretty symmetrical. But I also like to have the asymmetrical ring every now and then to really complement the unique handmade chain. Since it is handmade, you don't want it to be too perfect. It kind of takes away from it, I think. So there's your square. Something I like to remind my students when it comes to making different types of chain is that with the whole fusing process, it highly depends on the fact that the ring is round. So in order to fuse, the rings do have to be made into jump rings or round rings in order for them to fuse properly. In other words, if you had a wooden dowel that was square or triangle shaped, you wouldn't be able to make your wire square or triangle shaped and then fuse it. You would actually have to fuse them round and then shape them afterwards. So that is an important tip to remember. One of the other things I wanted to mention is the thicker wire you use. This is a 12 gauge wire, and I'll just bring this down next to it. I don't know if you can see the difference. Maybe I can get a close-up. This is a 12 gauge wire. This is what this ring's made of. I believe it's a 12 gauge. And then this square, I believe it was a 16 or 14 gauge wire. I want to say it was 14 gauge because the heart was 12. But what I wanted to get to is that the thicker wire you use, the more meatier, the heavier the link is going to look and feel. But because it's so heavy, if you were to use 12 gauge and wanted to do shapes like hearts and triangles and squares, it work hardens much faster than the thinner gauges. So if you did want to create this look with a thicker gauge wire, I'm going to show you some techniques on how to anneal or soften your metal so that you can continue to create the shapes, because ideally we want these shapes to be created without really marring or disfiguring the wire. We don't want the wire to look like it was marred, and we want it to look clean and polished, but we also want to have that handmade feel to it as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to attempt to make a square link out of this 12 gauge size ring, and what I'm going to do is just doing the same things, applying the same concept of squeezing the edges until I get a flat edge, and it's already resisting that little angle right there at that point. So what I'm going to do is anneal it, or go back to the torch, and I'm going to heat it up until it turns a bright orange. So I don't want to bring this into a molten state. I just want to heat up the ring evenly until it's a bright orange. And what that does is it softens up the metal, and it will lend itself to being more malleable, to be shaped easier. Remember, we want to shape the ring, but we don't want to mar the edges of the wire. So we don't want to mark it, we just want to shape it. So again, just heating it up enough to turn the ring a bright orange. And that's the state it's in before it actually fuses, remember. So if you go past that point, it will start to melt. So just enough till it's a bright orange. We'll quench that, make sure that it's dry. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and try and do one more side. So going back to the side I just did, squeezing the other edge. So I have two edges done right there. And then one more time on the other side. Once it starts resisting the shape that you're trying to form, go back, put it on the brick. So we are resisting any shape. We want to go ahead and attempt to anneal it one more time. You can anneal as many times as you need, as long as you don't overheat it, which will cause it to become molten again. And then, and if it starts to become in that state, it will start to pull apart from itself at the hottest point. So again, just so that it's heated up to the hottest point, or not the hottest point, I'm sorry, just heat it up evenly so it's a bright orange all the way around. And then quench it. Remember, don't touch it. It will burn your finger off. Okay, now we're going to finish shaping the rest of the ring. So I've applied a little bit of pressure on that last part. Now I'm going to go ahead and just keep going over all the edges until I get the shape that I want, until it's nice and even. If you want a really defined square, what I've done in the past is actually taken a file, and I'll pretend that this is my file right here. I've taken a file and actually created a crease there, a crease there, crease there, and a crease there. And then what that will do is they do it for framing. When they cut it so that it's like this, and they create a slice there, when it bends, it creates a cornered effect. So I've done that before, but I like the look of this just the same. I don't really care. I like that this looks almost like a casted ring as opposed to a soldered ring that was completely soldered at all edges here. Okay, so you've just learned a new way to shape, and that is the process of annealing really lends itself to shaping, especially using the thicker gauges of wire, and so that it creates no creases or no marred edges on your wire, and it just allows you to shape easier. And there you go. What I decided to do is throw in something for troubleshooting. What happens if this, what can you do if this happens? What I've done is I've cut a ring where only one side is flush and the other side has a point, and then I've cut another ring where they're somewhat connected. So what I hope to show is that when we actually start the fusing process, what happens if it doesn't fuse, what can you do, or what to look for in these circumstances. So I'm going to turn the lights off again and then go ahead and start the fusing again. So I'll start on this one. What I'd like to do is fuse this or heat this up to the point where it's going to fuse, but then I'm going to heat it up a little bit longer and show you what happens if you leave the heat on there too long. It doesn't so it's now fused, but I'm going to leave it on there just a little bit longer. It seems like a long time longer, but I'm going to leave it on there just a little bit longer and show you what happens. If the heat is on there too long, it either starts to bubble and show where the connection is rather than it being a clean cut, or it starts to ball away. It looks like a cool thing that maybe you can use it for something, but the wire is so soft it will not hold that shape. Now I'm going to show you what happens when both connections aren't flush or touching. Sometimes if the wire's thick, it will fuse, but you will always see a connection, and that's what we want to avoid. We want this fusing to look and be seamless. We don't want it to look we don't want it to show a crease. Now this ring, I purposely made it larger so that you can see that sometimes even though the connections aren't flush, it will still fuse, but you might see a large pit or a divot before it actually starts to fuse. Now it's starting to heat up and it wants to bond or fuse together, but it's going to start to pull away. So that one's pulled away. So I'm going to turn the lights on and show you what that looks like after I quench those. So on this one, I'm using my tool to touch it because it is still a hot surface. This one you can see one has a nice ball and this one's starting to ball. This one's same thing, it has a ball starting to form, and on this side it hasn't formed yet. What you can do in these circumstances, unless you need the rings to be exactly this size, then you might want to save it for another project. Usually what I do after they're quenched is I just cut or trim the part I can't use again. Now, the fusing not only works with it being a flush cut, but if you have one side that's larger in diameter than the other side, then it still will not bond or fuse. So you have to trim off the pieces that start to bubble. So that piece will be trimmed off. And even though this side hasn't started to bubble, I still trim that side off as well, so that it's still, both sides that are meeting will still be the same size and diameter of wire. So what I do with this is just trim off those pieces, apply a little bit of pressure so that wire is touching or connecting, and that ring is ready to be fused, or tried to be fused one more time. So that's what I do with those pieces. We're also going to be making a handmade S-clasp to attach to our chain. So as if we were making a bracelet, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to make a handmade S-clasp, and then how to attach it. This is a really cool technique to know, and whether you use it for bracelets or necklaces, or even just having or knowing how to make your own clasps that you can use for various strung projects or chain projects. What I'm going to do is, using a 2 1/4 inch piece of 14 gauge fine silver. You can do this with whatever gauge you want. I'm using 2 1/4 inches because it's going to take when I ball the ends, it's going to take length off of the whole S, or I should say it's going to take length away from the S clasp. I'm going to do that on both sides. My chain that I'm making it to, it's a pretty large oval length, so I want my S clasp to be proportionate to the chain. But you can make this S clasp in whatever gauges and whatever length you want, depending on how large you want the clasp and length to be. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to turn the lights off and then ball up the end. What I'm doing right now is just putting the torch on the very edge of the wire sticking off of the brick, so that I can concentrate all the heat on the edge here, just so that it's going to start to ball up. Once it starts to ball up, I'm going to turn my wire around. I'm not going to quench it. I'm going to turn it around because I want the other end to also be balled up. Once it starts to ball up, I'm going to rotate it slightly so that the ball is an even shape. It's not just balled to one side. I want that ball to be evenly centered. Once I do that, I'm going to rotate my wire. So now I'm going to ball up the other end. And this end will take half the time because it's the heat transfers up. So this end here is already warm, if not hot. So what I want to do is just ball it up a little bit. You can see how fast it's happening because of how hot the wire is. So once I have both ends balled up, I'm going to go ahead and turn the lights on to show you what it's done. Okay, so what I've done is just balled up both ends of the wire. Looks like a little T. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take it, we're done with the fire, with the torch, and we're just going to take it and shape it, but then we're going to go back to the torch in just a minute. Move my brick away. Now I'm going to switch to my medium wrap and tap. The reason for that is, remember it has this nylon sleeve or this plastic sleeve in it. What it does is I'm going to use it to shape the S part of my hook, but it's not going to mar my wire. It's not going to dent it like my round nose plier would. So again, this is a medium size wrap and tap using the tip of this wrap and tap plier. I'm going to take it and just shape a portion of it. And I'm going to take the other side and shape the other side in the opposite direction, like so. I usually like to make one side longer than the other. So this will be my short side, and then this will be my long side. So there's my little S clasp. Now I'm going to attach it directly to my chain. Okay, now I'm going to take my chain and I'm going to open up my S clasp and slide my chain in there. And then close this back up. Now what I like to do so that I'm only going to be using one side to attach my chain consistently, I'm going to actually apply just a little bit of, a little piece of fine silver right there on the edge, and I'm going to apply heat to it, and it's going to close or join these two pieces together. Okay, so I have this little piece of fine silver right here. It's really small. I'm going to place that right here where I want it to fuse. So I'm going to put it between the ball and this wire right there. Alright, it took me a little while, but I finally got it. So don't be frustrated. Sometimes that little piece, it's so small and there's not much for it to actually lay on. So it might take you a while to actually just lay it right in the right spot where it's going to sit. And again, don't get frustrated, because sometimes when your torch touches it, the force of the flame pushes it right off. So that can be something else. So just stop and go back and put it back on. I'm going to turn the lights off so you can see what we're doing and see it fuse together. Okay, I've made my flame a little bit smaller. You can see how it's really big, and I've just taken the levels and made it a little smaller. We just want to heat up that little piece enough to have that melt into the rest of the clasp. I don't want to melt the whole clasp, just that bright piece, that bright orange piece on top. Once that turns molten, it's going to want to go somewhere, and we want it to go into the crevice of the clasp. So notice I'm not doing like a circle, because I don't want to create another fused link. I just want to make that ball fuse into that little crevice. And there it goes. I'm going to just leave it on there a little bit longer. And there it goes. So you can see how it liquefied into that crevice. Now we're ready to quench the whole piece. Okay, so you can see how the S clasp, it's joined right there. It's no longer an open link. And I'll turn it around so you can see the other side where it's kind of connected. So again, there's no more opening between the ball and the body of the clasp. It's one solid piece now. This is, I like to make my S clasp like this so that it's completely connected. It's not detachable, but you can make it detachable. It's strong enough definitely to stay on there. I would like to mention that technique I just showed you, how I attached that separate wire to kind of join those two pieces together. It is, if you don't get it the first couple of times, don't become frustrated. That is, I would say, not even an intermediate technique. That's an advanced technique. It's really hard to control where you need to put the flame and how long to keep the flame on there to make those two pieces join together. And it's almost kind of like the concept of that is like soldering, where you're taking another component to join two pieces together. And all those, because this is fine silver, it all melts at the same temperature as opposed to solder. Solder melts at a lower temperature than sterling, so it's able to join much quicker and easier This is a much harder technique to hone. So don't get frustrated if you can't get it the first time. Again, that's something that I like to do as an added step to my clasps, but it's not something that you need to do. It's just something that it would be a nice technique to know and have. Thanks so much for taking my class. I hope that you had a great time, and I hope that now that you've learned the basics, you can move on to more advanced projects, and I hope to see you next time.